I'm Deborah Allen, 32 years old. Last Christmas, I arrived at a historic mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, my arms full of gifts, my heart overflowing with hope for a warm family gathering. I pictured the laughter, the hugs, and the carols filling the room glowing with lights. But as soon as I reached the door, my mother blocked me with a cold stare. "You're not welcome this year." I froze confused until my sister stepped forward, smirking cruelly. "This is no place for losers." Her words cut through me like a blade, shattering every expectation in an instant. All the joy I carried turned into humiliation and bitterness. Forcing a smile, I nodded and walked away, hiding my tears in the freezing night. Sitting in my car, I picked up the phone and said calmly but firmly, "Cancel everything. Right now." 30 minutes later, my sister was in tears, begging me to let her back into my life, but by then, it was far too late. Have you ever walked into a moment expecting warmth only to be met with betrayal instead? Share your story in the comments. I truly want to hear how you turned your pain into strength. My heels clicked on the polished wood floor as I pushed past the heavy oak door of the mansion. The chandelier light stung my eyes, but I wasn't here to admire the decor. My sister stood by the fireplace, wine glass in hand, laughing with a few cousins. My parents sat at the long dining table surrounded by plates of untouched food. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. Why wasn't I invited? I demanded, my voice sharper than I meant. My sister turned, her smile fading into something colder. "Oh, you're here," she said, setting her glass down. "Didn't expect you to show up after Mom told you to stay away." Her tone was smug, like she'd won some game I didn't know we were playing. I glanced at my mom, expecting her to say something, anything. She just looked down at her plate, rearranging her napkin. My dad shifted in his chair, eyes fixed on the tablecloth. "What's going on?" I pressed, stepping closer. "I've been helping you for years. $50,000 for your fashion business, and this is how you thank me." My sister rolled her eyes, crossing her arms. "Helping?" she scoffed. "You call those scraps helping? Your little handouts barely kept my boutique afloat. I needed real support, not your half-hearted checks." Her words hit like a slap. Handouts. I'd drained my savings to keep her dream alive, skipped vacations, worked overtime to cover her endless emergencies. I looked to my parents again, waiting for them to speak up. My mom's lips tightened, but she stayed silent. My dad cleared his throat, then muttered something about not wanting to stir things up. Their silence burned worse than my sister's words. "You think I'm some ATM for your failing business?" I said, my voice shaking. "I've given you everything I could." My sister smirked, leaning against the fireplace. "Everything, please. If you really cared, you'd have invested more. You're just jealous because I'm building something real while you're stuck crunching numbers all day." That was it. The room felt like it was closing in the air, thick with her arrogance. I thought of all the late nights I'd spent balancing her books, the checks I'd written without a second thought. She didn't just take my money, she took my trust and threw it back in my face. I pulled out my phone, my fingers steady, despite the anger boiling inside. "You know what I said," locking eyes with her. "I'm done." I dialed my financial advisor, my voice calm but firm. "Hey, it's me. That $50,000 investment for my sister's boutique. Cancel everything. Right now." My sister's smirk vanished. "What are you doing?" she snapped, stepping toward me. I held up a hand, stopping her. "You heard me?" I said to the advisor. "Pull every cent. I'm not funding this anymore." The call ended and the room went quiet. My sister's face paled, her eyes wide with something like panic. "You can't do that," she stammered. "You'll ruin me." I met her gaze, unflinching. "You did that yourself," I said. My parents exchanged a glance but said nothing. My mom's hands twisted in her lap, my dad's jaw clenched, but they didn't move. Their silence was louder than any argument. I turned to leave, my chest tight but my steps steady. "You'll regret this," my sister called after me, her voice sharp but unsteady. I didn't look back. I'd given her too much for too long, and she'd thrown it away with one cruel sentence. As I reached the door, I heard her husband murmur something to her, but I didn't catch it. I didn't need to. I'd made my choice, and there was no going back. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside. I sat in my car outside the mansion, the engine humming as I gripped the steering wheel. My phone buzzed, lighting up with a notification from my sister's fashion supplier. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew what I'd done. My call to cancel her $50,000 investment would hit her hard and fast. Barely 30 minutes had passed since I hung up, but I could already imagine the chaos unfolding. My sister's smug face from earlier flashed in my mind, her voice echoing with that biting arrogance. I pushed it away, focusing on the road ahead, but my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a Facebook notification. Curious, I opened the app. My sister had posted publicly, her words glaring on the screen. "Some people pretend to be family but won't lift a finger to help. Pathetic." The post was tagged to me, my name bolded for everyone to see. Comments were already piling up, her friends, our cousins, even strangers piling on, calling me selfish, stingy, a failure. My chest tightened, a fresh wave of hurt washing over me. She didn't just betray me in private. She was dragging my name through the mud for the world to see. I scrolled through the comments, each one a new stab. "What kind of sister does that one read?" "No wonder she's alone," another sneered. I locked my phone, my hands shaking. How dare she? After everything I'd sacrificed, years of writing checks, covering her debts, believing her promises, she painted me as the villain. The hurt burned hotter than the anger from the mansion, fueling something colder, more resolute. I wasn't just done. I was finished with her for good. Then my phone rang. Her number flashed on the screen. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "What do you want?" I said, my voice flat. "Please." My sister's voice cracked, frantic. "You have to fix this. The supplier just emailed. They're pulling the contract for my spring collection. It's worth millions. I'm done without it." Her words tumbled out, desperate, nothing like the confidence she'd thrown at me earlier. "You can't let this happen. Give me a seat at your table again, please. I need that money back." Her plea was a punch to the gut. A seat at my table. She meant my bank account, my trust, the support she'd mocked just minutes ago. I could hear her pacing, her breath hitching like she was on the verge of tears. But her Facebook post still glowed in my mind, those cruel words etched into my memory. "You crossed a line." I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside. "You took my money, insulted me, and now you're trashing me online." "You think I owe you anything? I didn't mean it," she cried. I was upset. "Okay, I'll delete the post. Just call your advisor back, reinstate the funds. I'm begging you." Her voice broke, but it didn't move me. I'd heard her excuses before, every time she missed a payment, every time she borrowed more than she could repay. This wasn't remorse. It was panic. "No," I said, my tone final. "You made your choice. You don't get to rewrite it now." I hung up before she could respond, her pleas cut off by the silence of the call ending. My phone buzzed again, another notification, probably more comments on her post, but I turned it off. I didn't need to see it. Her words, her desperation, none of it changed what she'd done. She'd humiliated me, not just to our family, but to everyone we knew. And for what? To save face while her business crumbled, I leaned back in my seat, the weight of my decision settling in. Cutting her off wasn't just about the money, it was about cutting out the lies, the manipulation, the years of being used. My parents' silence back at the mansion stung, but my sister's public attack was a betrayal I couldn't forgive. I'd given her everything, and she'd thrown it back in my face. Now she'd face the consequences alone. A few days after Christmas, I was nursing a coffee at my kitchen table when my phone pinged with a text. It was from her husband, a number I hadn't saved but recognized from years of family group chats. "We need to talk," the message read. "It's about your sister's spending." My stomach knotted. I'd been trying to shake off the sting of her public attack online, but this felt different, urgent, almost heavy. I typed back, "What do you mean?" His reply came fast. "She's been lying to you. Meet me at the diner on Thames Street." Noon. I arrived at the diner, a small place with chipped red booths and the faint smell of fried eggs. Her husband was already there, sitting in a corner, his face-drawn eyes darting like he was afraid of being seen. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice low. "I can't keep quiet anymore. Your sister's been using your money for things you didn't sign off on." I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. What things, I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He slid his phone across the table, showing a screenshot of a bank statement. "Designer handbags, 5-star hotels, a trip to Paris last spring," he said. "Your $50,000 didn't go to her boutique. It went to her lifestyle." I stared at the numbers. Thousands spent on luxury brands, travel agencies, high-end restaurants. My money, the savings I'd poured into her dream, had funded her Instagram-perfect vacations. My hands clenched into fists, a slow burn spreading through me. "Why are you telling me this now?" I demanded. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I'm done covering for her. She's out of control, and I'm worried about our kids." His voice cracked, and for the first time I saw guilt in his eyes. I nodded, too angry to trust my words. I needed proof, something solid to confront the betrayal I felt. "I'll handle it," I said, standing to leave. That afternoon, I booked an appointment with Martin Gray, a lawyer I'd worked with on a contract dispute years ago. His office was a small, tidy space in downtown Newport, walls lined with law books and a single photo of his kids. "Good to see you," Deborah Martin said, shaking my hand. "What's going on?" I explained everything: my sister's boutique, the $50,000 I'd invested, her husband's text, the screenshots. "I need to know the truth," I said, my voice steady but tight. Martin nodded, pulling out his laptop. "Let's dig into it." He contacted my financial advisor and requested records of every transaction tied to my sister's business account. Within hours, he had a stack of documents, invoices, bank transfers, credit card statements. I sat across from him, my heart sinking as he walked me through the evidence. A $3,000 handbag from Saks. A $10,000 deposit for a Paris hotel. A $5,000 payment to a travel agency for a Caribbean cruise. None of it had gone to fabric suppliers, employee wages, or store rent. "This is fraud," Martin said, his tone matter-of-fact but serious. "Your sister misrepresented how she'd use your investment. You could sue for restitution." I shook my head, the weight of her betrayal settling in. I didn't want a lawsuit. I wanted answers, closure, anything to make sense of why she'd lied. "How could she do this?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. Martin leaned back, his expression softening. "Some people take trust for granted. They think it's a blank check." I left his office with copies of the documents, my mind racing. My sister hadn't just taken my money, she'd built a facade with it, parading her success while I worked overtime to keep her afloat. The trips, the designer bags, the social media posts I'd liked, without question, they were all lies. I thought of her smug face at the mansion, her cruel words online, her desperate pleas when her supplier bailed. She'd played me for years, and I'd let her. As I drove home, the documents heavy in my bag, a new clarity took hold. The first week of January brought a knock at my door, sharp and unexpected. I opened it to find my parents standing on my porch in the chilly Rhode Island suburbs, their faces tight with purpose. My mom clutched her purse, her eyes avoiding mine, while my dad shifted his weight, his usual calm replaced by unease. "We need to talk," my dad said, his voice low but firm. I hesitated, then stepped aside to let them in, my gut telling me this wasn't a friendly visit. They sat stiffly on my living room couch, the same one I'd bought with my own money after years of supporting my sister. "Your sister's in trouble?" My mom started, her hands twisting together. "Her boutique is falling apart because you pulled your funding. You need to help her?" Her words were a punch, direct and unapologetic. I stared, disbelief rising like a tide. "Help her?" I said, my voice sharp. "After she lied to me, used my money for designer bags and vacations." My dad raised a hand, his tone conciliatory. She made mistakes, sure, but she's family. You can't just abandon her. His words echoed their silence at the mansion when they'd let her call me a loser without a word. I leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, trying to keep my anger in check. You didn't say a word when she humiliated me, I said. You stood by while she trashed me online. And now you're here, asking me to bail her out again. My mom's face hardened, her voice rising. You're being selfish, Deborah. Your sister needs you. She's struggling, and you're sitting here fine with your fancy job and your perfect life. Perfect life. I almost laughed. My job as an accountant was steady, but it wasn't glamorous. I'd sacrificed vacation savings time all to prop up my sister's failing dreams. Selfish, I shot back. I gave her $50,000. She spent it on herself, not her business. I'm done being her bank. My dad sighed, rubbing his temples. Family sticks together, he said, his voice softer but insistent. You could give her another chance. Reinstate the funds just enough to get her back on her feet. I shook my head, the weight of their bias pressing down. They hadn't come to hear my side. They'd come to defend her, to guilt me into opening my wallet again. You always take her side, I said, my voice trembling. Even after she lied, after she betrayed me. Why is it always me who has to fix things? Before they could answer, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my friend Gail Reed, who'd been my rock through this mess. Heard your parents are there. Need backup. I typed back a quick, yes, and within minutes Gail was at my door, her presence a steady anchor. She stepped inside, her sharp eyes taking in my parents' tense postures. What's going on? Gail asked, her tone calm but protective. I explained, my words spilling out. They want me to fund my sister again after everything she's done. Gail's jaw tightened, but she stayed composed. You've given enough, she said, looking straight at my parents. Deborah's not the problem here. Your other daughter lied and used her. Why are you blaming the one who's been hurt? Her words were blunt, cutting through the tension like a knife. My mom bristled, her voice sharp. You don't understand family, Gail. This is between us. Gail didn't flinch. I understand loyalty, she said. And Deborah deserves better than this. Her support steadied me, grounding my resolve. I turned to my parents, my voice firm. I'm done, I said. Not just with her, but with all of this. I won't be guilted into fixing her messes anymore. If you can't see that, we're through. My dad's face fell, his mouth opening to protest, but my mom grabbed his arm, silencing him. They stood there, expressions a mix of frustration and disbelief, and walked out without another word. The door clicked shut, and I felt a strange relief, like a weight had lifted. Gail put a hand on my shoulder, her voice soft. You did the right thing, she said. I nodded, the finality of my words sinking in. I'd cut the cord not just with my sister, but with the family that chose her over me. A week after my parents' visit, my phone lit up with another text from her husband. I'm leaving her, it read. Taking the kids to my mom's place in Providence. Can we talk? My heart sank. Not for my sister, but for their kids. 2 boys and a girl barely old enough to understand the mess their parents had made. I typed back, agreeing to meet him at a coffee shop in Warwick, a short drive from my place. I wasn't sure what he wanted, but his earlier honesty about my sister's spending had earned him a sliver of my trust. At the coffee shop, he sat across from me, his eyes hollow, shoulders slumped under the weight of his decision. I can't stay with her anymore, he said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. The lies, the money, she's run the boutique into the ground, and now she's taking it out on the kids. His voice was steady but raw, like he'd been holding this in for too long. I nodded, my jaw tight. What's your plan? I asked. I'm moving the kids to my mother's house, he said. It's a small place, but it's safe. I need to find a rental nearby, something I can afford on my bank salary. I don't want them growing up in that chaos. I thought of my sister, her lavish spending, her public attacks on me. She'd built a house of cards, and now it was collapsing around her family. I'll help you, I said, my voice firm. But this is for you and the kids, not her. She's out of my life. He looked at me, relief flickering in his eyes. I get it, he said. I don't want her involved either. She's burned too many bridges. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for rentals in Providence, filtering for places close to his mother's house. Within an hour, we'd found a modest 2-bedroom apartment, affordable but clean. I offered to cover the first month's rent and deposit a small gesture to keep those kids stable. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. I'm not doing it for you, I replied, meeting his gaze. I'm doing it for them. The kids didn't deserve to pay for their mother's mistakes. He nodded understanding and promised to pay me back when he could. I didn't care about the money, it was nothing compared to what I'd lost to my sister. Helping him felt like drawing a line away to protect what mattered without letting her back in. Meanwhile, word reached me through a mutual friend that my sister was spiraling. Without my funding, her boutique couldn't cover its debts. Suppliers had cut her off, and her employees were quitting unpaid. She'd tried borrowing from friends, but her reputation tarnished by her own social media rants made them wary. Her credit cards were maxed out, her savings drained on luxuries she couldn't sustain. I pictured her in her fancy house, surrounded by designer bags. She couldn't sell her phone, silent as her so-called allies turned away. I felt a pang of pity, but it passed quickly. She'd chosen this path, lying to me, betraying my trust, attacking me publicly. Now she was facing the fallout alone. I'd spent years cleaning up her messes, but no more. My focus was on helping her husband get his kids settled, not on bailing her out. I wired the payment for the apartment deposit, confirming with the landlord over a quick call. It's done, I told him as we left the coffee shop. You're set for the month. He shook my hand, his grip firm but weary. Thank you, he said. The kids will be okay now. I nodded, hoping he was right. As I drove back to my place, I thought about the family I'd once had, parents who took her side, a sister who used me, kids caught in the middle. I'd cut them out, but helping those kids felt like a small redemption, a way to hold on to my own values without giving in to her chaos. I turned onto my street, the weight of my choice settling in. Late January brought a quiet evening, broken by my phone ringing. My sister's number flashed on the screen, and I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the decline button. Weeks had passed since I'd cut her off, and the silence had been a relief. But curiosity won out, and I answered. What do you want? I asked, my voice cold. I'm sorry, she said, her tone rushed, almost rehearsed. I messed up, okay? I shouldn't have said those things online, but you didn't have to destroy my business. Her words carried a familiar edge, blaming me, even as she apologized. I gripped the phone tighter, my patience thinning. You destroyed it yourself, I said. You lied about my money, spent it on luxuries, and then trashed me publicly. Don't put this on me. She sighed, dramatic and forced. I was stressed, Deborah. You don't know what it's like to run a boutique. I needed those trips to network to keep up appearances. You could have helped more instead of pulling the plug. I almost laughed at her nerve. Even now, she couldn't own her mistakes. You're not sorry, I said. You're just scared because it's all falling apart. She went quiet, and I hung up her half-hearted plea, fading into nothing. The next day, my parents called, their voices heavy with urgency. We need to fix this, family. My dad said, his tone softer than at my house. Your sister's in a bad place. She's lost everything. I sat on my couch, staring out the window at the bare trees lining my street. She lost it because she lied, I said. I'm not going back. My mom jumped in, her voice pleading. She's your sister. You can't turn your back on blood. Let's sit down, talk it out. Their words stung, stirring memories of their silence when I needed them. You didn't stand up for me, I said, my voice steady but sharp. Not at the mansion, not when she attacked me online, not when you came to my house. I'm done trying to fix what you won't. My dad started to protest, but I cut him off. I want to live my life, not clean up hers. If you can't respect that, we're done too. The line went silent, and they hung up, their attempt at peace crumbling. I leaned back, a strange calm settling over me. I'd spent years tying my worth to their approval, but no more. I wanted a life free of their expectations, their bias, their endless demands to save my sister. Word spread quickly about her downfall. A friend texted me a news article her boutique had shuttered, the lease terminated for unpaid rent. She'd sold her house in Newport, the one she'd flaunted as a symbol of success, to cover debts. Now she was living in a small apartment, scraping by on social assistance, her designer wardrobe pawned off for pennies. I pictured her alone, surrounded by the remnants of a life she'd built on lies, and felt no satisfaction, only a quiet resolve to keep my distance. Her collapse was complete. Suppliers wouldn't touch her, her former friends had vanished, and her husband had taken their kids to start over. My parents' calls stopped, their energy for reconciliation fading as her reality sank in. I'd heard she'd tried starting a new venture, some online shop, but it failed within weeks, her reputation too damaged to recover. She was out of options, out of excuses, and out of my life. I thought about the years I'd spent propping her up, believing her promises, trusting her dreams. Each betrayal, her spending her words, her refusal to change had pushed me to this point. I wasn't the villain she'd painted me as, nor the savior my parents wanted. I was just me, choosing myself for once. As I set my phone down, the weight of my freedom felt real. By spring, the air in Rhode Island felt lighter, and so did I. For the first time in years, I woke up without the weight of my sister's demands or my parents' expectations pressing down on me. My days settled into a rhythm that was mine alone, mornings at my accounting firm, crunching numbers with a clarity I hadn't felt in ages, and evenings with friends who didn't ask me to fix their lives. Gail and I started a weekly dinner tradition at a seaside cafe in Newport, laughing over plates of clam chowder and stories that didn't revolve around family drama. I even took up painting again, a hobby I'd abandoned when my sister's crises took over. My small house in the suburbs, once a place I crashed between her emergencies, became a sanctuary, filled with my own choices, books I wanted to read, colors I chose for the walls. I heard about my sister through whispers from old acquaintances. She was still in that cramped apartment, scraping by on social assistance, her once glamorous life reduced to thrift store clothes and a part-time job at a local diner. She hadn't changed, not really. A mutual friend mentioned she'd been venting to anyone who'd listen, blaming me, her husband, even the economy for her downfall. "Deborah ruined me," she'd say, her voice sharp with resentment, as if her lies and choices hadn't burned every bridge she had. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a quiet distance. Her life was her own now, and I no longer carried its weight. My parents stopped reaching out, their silence a confirmation of the line I'd drawn. I didn't hate them, but I couldn't keep chasing their approval. They'd chosen my sister's side too many times, and I'd spent too long trying to prove I was enough. Letting go of that need was like stepping into sunlight after years in the shade. I didn't need their validation to know my worth. My work, my friends, the life I was building, they were proof enough. I thought about her husband and their kids sometimes. He'd sent me a thank you note after settling into the apartment I'd helped him rent, promising to keep the kids safe and stable. I didn't ask about my sister, and he didn't mention her. It was better that way. The kids deserved a chance to grow up without her chaos, and I trusted he'd make that happen. I'd done my part not out of obligation, but because it was right. Looking back, the lesson was clear, carved into every choice I'd made. I'd spent years pouring my heart and money into my sister, believing kindness would fix her, that family meant carrying her burdens. But kindness isn't a debt others can claim, it's a gift, and it should never be weaponized. She'd taken my generosity, twisted it, and used it to fuel her own ego, leaving me to pick up the pieces. I'd learned that boundaries aren't selfish, they're survival. In a place like America, where independence is a cornerstone, I'd finally embraced it. Standing on my own wasn't lonely, it was liberating. I started volunteering at a community center, helping women navigate financial planning. It wasn't about saving anyone, but about giving them tools to save themselves. Every time I sat with someone explaining budgets or savings plans, I saw a piece of myself, the part that had once trusted too much, given too much, and learned the hard way to prioritize my own stability. I wasn't perfect, but I was free, and that was enough. My sister's story wasn't mine to write anymore. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. While she pointed fingers, I built a life that didn't revolve around her mistakes. The mansion, the money, the family ties, they were part of a chapter I'd closed. As I walked along the cliffs of Newport one evening, the ocean stretching wide before me, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. My life wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about living for me on my terms with no apologies.
"You're not even her real granddaughter," my father spat, his face contorted with rage. "Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune." I stood frozen in Grandmother Eleanor's study, the heavy oak shelves filled with leather-bound classics surrounding us like silent witnesses to his cruelty. My grandmother had been buried only 3 days ago, and already the family was fracturing over her will. "What are you talking about?" I managed, my voice barely audible over the thundering of my heart. "Don't play innocent, Jennifer. Your mother's little secret isn't so secret anymore." He paced the oriental rug, pausing to glare at the formal portrait of grandmother hanging above the fireplace. "Eleanor was obsessed with bloodlines. Once the lawyer confirms you've got no Blackwell blood, you'll get nothing." I looked him directly in the eyes, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Do you promise to keep your word about this? That only blood relatives deserve grandmother's inheritance?" "Absolutely," he declared, lifting his chin with the same imperious tilt I'd seen countless times throughout my childhood. "I'll make sure the family legacy stays with real Blackwells, not imposters." "My name is Jennifer Blackwell. I'm 27 years old, and until 5 minutes ago, I believed Douglas Blackwell was my biological father. Now, standing in my grandmother's Georgian mansion in suburban Philadelphia, I was apparently discovering otherwise. What I wanted was simple: the fair treatment Grandmother Eleanor intended in her will. She had specifically mentioned me, her only granddaughter, during our last conversation about her estate plans. Standing in my way was the man who had always viewed me with thinly veiled contempt, the man whose approval I had spent decades trying to earn unsuccessfully. "You can attend the will reading next week if you must," he continued dismissively, "but don't expect anything. I've already spoken with Harrison about challenging any provisions that include you." Harrison Mills was my father's longtime friend and our family attorney. The mention of their apparent collusion sent a chill through me. "I'll be there," I replied quietly. "Grandmother wanted me there." "Sentiment," he scoffed. "Eleanor always had a blind spot for you. Fortunately, the law cares about facts, not feelings." As he strode from the room, I sank into grandmother's desk chair, running my fingers over the polished walnut surface where she had written countless letters, reviewed business documents, and most recently, finalized her will. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "We need to talk about your father. Tonight, alone." I stared at the message, unease crawling up my spine. If my father wasn't my biological father, then who was? And how had this secret remained hidden for 27 years? More importantly, why was it surfacing now, just days after grandmother's death and days before her fortune would be distributed? Whatever truth awaited me, one thing was becoming clear. The father I had spent my life trying to please had been harboring resentment far deeper than I had ever realized. Growing up as a Blackwell meant navigating a world of privilege and weighty expectations. The Blackwell fortune, built on pharmaceutical patents and shrewd investments, had sustained 3 generations of the family in considerable luxury. My father, Douglas, was the elder of 2 sons, which automatically positioned him as the presumptive heir to the majority of the Blackwell assets. His younger brother, James, had been the family rebel, brilliant but restless, unwilling to conform to our grandfather's rigid vision of the family legacy. He'd left Philadelphia to pursue medical research in Seattle, returning only occasionally for major family events. My memories of Uncle James were limited but warm. His easy laugh, thoughtful gifts, and the way he'd speak to me as though my opinions mattered. In contrast, my relationship with my father had always been strained. Douglas Blackwell was a man who measured worth in achievements and status. My brothers, Thomas and William, had fulfilled his expectations admirably, Thomas following him into the family business, William excelling in law school. I, however, had disappointed him at every turn. "She lacks the Blackwell drive," he'd remarked to my mother when he thought I couldn't hear. "Too soft, too unfocused." Despite graduating with honors and establishing a promising career in historical preservation, nothing I accomplished seemed to meet his standard. I'd attributed this perpetual disappointment to sexism or perhaps unrealistic expectations, never imagining there might be a more fundamental reason for his distance. Grandmother Eleanor had been my sanctuary. Unlike my father, she valued my interest in history and art, encouraging me to pursue a path that honored my passions rather than family tradition. During my undergraduate years, I'd visit her estate every Sunday for tea, listening to her stories of family history and her own quiet rebellions against the constraints placed on women of her generation. "Remember, Jennifer," she often told me, "a Blackwell makes their own path." Her death at 86 had been peaceful, but left an emptiness I was still struggling to navigate. The knowledge that I'd lost my greatest advocate within the family made her absence even more profound. In the days following her funeral, I'd noticed subtle changes in my father's behavior, heightened scrutiny when I interacted with other family members, hushed conversations with Harrison Mills that abruptly ended when I entered a room. I'd dismissed these observations as grief manifesting in different ways, but now they took on a more sinister significance. The last time I'd seen grandmother alive, she'd held my hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Trust your instincts, Jennifer. Not everything is as it appears." At the time, I'd attributed her cryptic words to medication or fatigue. Now I wondered if she'd been trying to prepare me for the storm that was about to break over our family. As I left grandmother's study to meet my mother, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into a family drama decades in the making, one with roots deeper than I could yet comprehend. My mother was waiting for me at her favorite cafe, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, where Blackwells were just ordinary people. She looked smaller somehow, her usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she began without preamble, her fingers nervously turning her wedding band. "Your father, Douglas, shouldn't have told you like that. It was cruel and self-serving." "So it's true?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's not my biological father?" She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "It's complicated, Jennifer. More complicated than Douglas makes it sound." Over the next hour, my mother unraveled a story that upended everything I thought I knew about my family. She and James, my uncle, had been in love before she met Douglas. They'd been young, passionate, and planning a future together when James received a prestigious research fellowship in Seattle. "We agreed he should go," she explained. "It was an incredible opportunity. We thought we could manage the distance." But the separation had strained their relationship, and during a particularly difficult period, she'd grown close to Douglas, who had always admired her from afar. A moment of vulnerability led to a brief relationship, one she ended when she realized her heart still belonged to James. When I discovered I was pregnant, I was certain it was James's child. The timing aligned perfectly with his last visit home. Her voice trembled. But Douglas insisted the child was his, and James was already engaged to someone else by then. I didn't want to disrupt his new life. Douglas had proposed immediately, presenting their marriage as the honorable solution. Only later did my mother realize that his interest had never been entirely about her. The Blackwell fortune had strict inheritance provisions that favored male heirs with legitimate children. "He needed a wife and children to secure his position," she said bitterly, "and I needed stability for my baby. It seemed like the best option at the time." Years passed and the secret held. James eventually moved back to Philadelphia with his wife, but they remained childless. When his marriage ended in divorce, he threw himself into medical research, becoming increasingly distant from family affairs. "Did James ever know?" I asked. "No," my mother whispered. "I couldn't bear to disrupt his life again. And as the years passed, it seemed crueler to reveal the truth." The revelation left me reeling. Every memory of childhood now required re-examination. My father's coldness, Uncle James's warmth during his rare visits, Grandmother Eleanor's special attention to me. "Why is Douglas revealing this now?" I finally asked. My mother's expression hardened. "Your grandmother's will. He's always been obsessed with the Blackwell fortune, and now he's worried Eleanor might have left you a significant portion. He needs to discredit your claim." "But if I'm not a blood Blackwell?" "That's just it," she interrupted. "You are a Blackwell by blood, just not Douglas's child. You're James's daughter, which makes you Eleanor's granddaughter by blood regardless." The irony was almost too perfect. My father's attempt to cut me out of the inheritance by denying our biological connection might actually strengthen my claim through a different branch of the family tree. "What do I do now?" I asked, feeling adrift in this new reality. My mother reached across the table to clasp my hands. "That depends on what you want, Jennifer. Justice? Acknowledgement? Or simply your fair share of what Eleanor intended for you?" I didn't have an answer yet. The betrayal was too fresh, the implications too vast to process in a single conversation. But as we left the cafe, one certainty crystallized in my mind. I would not allow Douglas Blackwell to rewrite my history for his financial gain. The question was how to prove my true parentage before the will reading, and whether that truth would help or harm my position in the complex web of Blackwell inheritance rules. The next morning, I drove to Uncle James's apartment, heart hammering against my ribs. I had called ahead, keeping my reason vague. Family matters to discuss before the will reading. Now, sitting in his modest living room surrounded by scientific journals and travel mementos, I struggled to find the words to upend his world alongside mine. "You seem troubled, Jennifer," he observed, setting 2 cups of tea on the coffee table. At 58, James Blackwell remained handsome, with the same dark eyes I saw in my mirror every morning. "Is Douglas making things difficult about Eleanor's estate?" "It's more complicated than that," I began, then faltered. "How did one ask a man if he might be your biological father? Uncle James, did you and my mother were you ever together? Before she married father?" The cup froze halfway to his lips, his expression shifting from surprise to guarded caution. "Why would you ask about ancient history now?" "Because Douglas has informed me that he's not my biological father, and he's using that claim to challenge my place in grandmother's will." James set his cup down with deliberate care. "That sounds like Douglas, calculating even in cruelty." He studied my face with new intensity. "What has your mother told you?" I recounted my mother's revelations about their past relationship, watching his expressions cycle through nostalgia, pain, and something that looked remarkably like hope. "I never knew," he said finally. "Catherine never told me she was pregnant. By the time I heard about the marriage, it was already done." He leaned forward. "Jennifer, are you saying you believe I might be your father?" "The timing fits, according to Mother. But Douglas is determined to prove I have no Blackwell blood to claim my inheritance." James's expression darkened. "Eleanor's will specifically mentions you by name. Douglas can't simply write you out of it. He claims he can challenge any provisions made under false pretenses, namely that grandmother believed me to be his biological daughter." James rose abruptly, pacing the small room. "This is absurd. Even if you were not Douglas's biological child, you're still Eleanor's granddaughter if you're my daughter." He stopped, meeting my gaze directly. "We need to know for certain. A DNA test would settle this question definitively." The clinical simplicity of his solution both relieved and terrified me. "You'd be willing to take one?" Without hesitation, he replied. I've always felt a connection to you that I couldn't quite explain. If you are my daughter... His voice caught. Well, let's confirm the facts before we get ahead of ourselves. We arranged for expedited testing that same day, using a private lab that promised results within 72 hours, just enough time before the will reading. As we submitted our samples, a strange combination of dread and anticipation settled in my stomach. Regardless of the outcome, my relationship with both men would be irrevocably altered. While awaiting results, I attempted to gather information about grandmother's will. I contacted her personal attorney, Bernard Walsh, separate from the family lawyer Harrison Mills. I'm afraid I can't discuss the specific provisions before the official reading, Bernard explained when I visited his office. But I can assure you that your grandmother was of sound mind and very clear about her intentions. Did she know? I asked directly. About my biological parentage? Bernard's carefully neutral expression slipped momentarily. I cannot comment on that, but I will say that Eleanor Blackwell was a remarkably perceptive woman who very little escaped her notice. His non-answer told me everything I needed to know. Grandmother had suspected, perhaps even confirmed, that I was James's daughter, not Douglas's. My momentary triumph evaporated when I received a formal letter that evening. Harrison Mills had petitioned the court to delay the will reading pending resolution of identity concerns regarding purported beneficiaries. Douglas was moving faster than anticipated, using his legal connections to buy time while he built his case against me. When I called Bernard to ask about the delay, his secretary informed me he had been suddenly hospitalized with pneumonia and would be unavailable indefinitely. It couldn't be coincidence. Douglas was systematically removing my potential allies and information sources. Without Bernard or the DNA results, I would enter the will reading at a severe disadvantage. That night, my mother called in a panic. Douglas knows you met with James. He's furious. Jennifer, be careful. When Douglas feels threatened, he becomes dangerous. The DNA results arrived via encrypted email 2 days before the rescheduled will reading. With trembling fingers, I opened the document, scanning for the conclusion buried amid scientific terminology. Probability of paternity, 99.99998%. James Blackwell was unquestionably my biological father. I sat back, emotions flooding through me. Vindication, grief for the relationship I never had, anger at the years of deception. The scientific confirmation transformed abstract possibility into concrete reality. Douglas, the man who had coldly rejected me my entire life, was not my father at all. I immediately called James, who received the news with quiet emotion. I suspected from the moment you asked, he admitted. You have Catherine's smile, but those eyes, they're Blackwell eyes, my mother's eyes. We agreed to meet before the will reading to discuss our approach. Armed with DNA proof, I finally had leverage against Douglas. Or so I thought. That evening, Harrison Mills requested an urgent meeting at his office. Despite my misgivings, I agreed, curious about this sudden outreach from my father's, no, Douglas's, legal ally. The elegant offices of Mills and Associates signaled old money and discretion. Harrison, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, greeted me with practiced cordiality that didn't reach his eyes. Jennifer, thank you for coming. I thought we should discuss certain developments before the will reading. You mean the fact that Douglas isn't my biological father, or that you filed a frivolous petition to delay the reading? His smile tightened. Actually, I was referring to the DNA test you and James arranged. My blood ran cold. How could he possibly know about the test? We had been meticulously careful. Douglas was quite distressed to learn of this independent investigation, Harrison continued. He asked me to convey a proposal. He slid a document across his desk. It was a waiver agreement relinquishing all claims to Eleanor Blackwell's estate in exchange for a one-time payment of $250,000. This is absurd, I said, pushing it back. Grandmother specifically included me in her will. Yes, under the presumption you were Douglas's daughter. Now that we know otherwise, now we know I'm James's daughter, which makes me even more legitimately Eleanor's granddaughter than if I were Douglas's, I interrupted. Blood relatives deserve the family fortune, isn't that what Douglas always says? Harrison's expression shifted. There are complexities you're unaware of, Jennifer. Legal nuances regarding the Blackwell Trust that supersede simple biology. What complexities? I'm not at liberty to discuss details before the reading, but I strongly advise you to consider this offer. Douglas is prepared to be quite aggressive in defending the family interests. The veiled threat hung between us. I left without signing, more determined than ever to stand my ground, but deeply unsettled by Harrison's confidence despite our seemingly ironclad DNA evidence. The next morning brought the revelation that shattered my understanding of the entire situation. James called, his voice tight with controlled fury. Jennifer, I've just received some disturbing information from an old family friend, a nurse who worked with my father decades ago. He paused. Douglas isn't biologically a Blackwell. What? The room seemed to tilt around me. Apparently, my parents adopted Douglas as an infant after my mother had several miscarriages. When she unexpectedly became pregnant with me years later, they decided to keep the adoption quiet, not wanting Douglas to feel like less than their son. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Douglas wasn't a blood Blackwell, then by his own logic. Does Douglas know? I managed. I don't think so. Our parents took the secret to their graves. But Eleanor might have known. She and my mother were extremely close. That's why Harrison was so confident, I breathed. There must be something in the will or trust documents specifying blood relations. Exactly. I've been reviewing copies of the original Blackwell Trust. There's a specific clause requiring direct bloodline descent for principal inheritance. Douglas would have been protected by his legal adoption, but by making this about biological legitimacy, he's potentially disqualified himself. The irony was almost too perfect. Douglas's attempt to disinherit me by questioning my biological connection to the Blackwell line could backfire catastrophically if his own adoption came to light. What do we do with this information? I asked. James was quiet for a moment. That depends on what you want, Jennifer. What Douglas deserves and what's right for our family might be different things. I considered his words carefully. I think, I said slowly, that people who insist on blood purity should be held to their own standards, don't you? The morning of the will reading dawned crisp and clear, Philadelphia's autumn painting the trees in brilliant hues outside grandmother's mansion where the family had gathered. I arrived early with James, our shared secret a fragile weapon we weren't yet certain how to deploy. Harrison Mills presided from the head of the dining table, leather portfolio open before him, while various Blackwell relatives filled the high-backed chairs. Douglas sat directly opposite me, his posture radiating confidence, flanked by my brothers who looked uncomfortable but determined to support their father. Before we begin, Harrison announced, I must address a delicate matter regarding succession eligibility. Douglas straightened, shooting me a triumphant glance. It has come to our attention that certain beneficiaries named in Eleanor Blackwell's will may not qualify under the bloodline provisions of the original Blackwell Family Trust. My mother, seated beside me, gripped my hand beneath the table. Harrison continued, As you know, Eleanor's estate is divided between assets she controlled independently and those governed by the family trust established by her father. The trust specifically requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of the Blackwell line. Which is precisely why we need to address Jennifer's situation, Douglas interrupted smoothly. Recent information suggests she is not my biological daughter, and therefore has no claim to the Blackwell inheritance. A ripple of murmurs circulated around the table. James and I exchanged glances, our carefully rehearsed plan suddenly derailed by Douglas's preemptive strike. I have DNA evidence, Douglas continued, sliding a folder toward Harrison. confirming Jennifer is not my biological child. Under the bloodline requirement, she is ineligible for trust distribution. My heart pounded as Harrison reviewed the documents. We had anticipated raising the paternity issue ourselves, but Douglas had outmaneuvered us by presenting his own testing I had never consented to or provided samples for. "May I ask how you obtained my DNA for this test?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice level. Douglas's smile was cold. "From your water glass at our last family dinner. Quite simple, really." "That's illegal," James interjected. "Unauthorized DNA testing." "Irrelevant to the inheritance question," Harrison cut in. "The science is sound, regardless of collection methods." I felt our carefully constructed plan crumbling. If Harrison accepted Douglas's evidence while dismissing the legality of collection, we would lose our chance to reveal the truth on our terms. "I have additional evidence pertinent to the bloodline question," I said firmly, removing our own testing results from my bag. "DNA confirmation that James Blackwell is my biological father." The room erupted in shocked exclamations. Douglas's face contorted with fury as he turned on my mother, who met his gaze unflinchingly. "This changes nothing," Harrison insisted after reviewing our documentation. "The trust specifies Blackwell blood from Eleanor's direct line, which flows through her son Douglas to his legitimate heirs." It was the opening we needed. James stood slowly, commanding the room's attention. "I believe we need to examine the precise language of the trust," he said. "My understanding is that it requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of Harold Blackwell, Eleanor's father. If that's the case, we have a significant problem." Harrison frowned. "What problem?" "Douglas is not biologically a Blackwell," James stated clearly. "He was adopted as an infant, a fact our parents kept private to protect him, but which Eleanor was aware of." The silence that followed was deafening. Douglas's face drained of color as he stared at his brother in naked shock. "That's absurd," he finally sputtered. "A desperate lie." "I have the adoption records," James continued implacably, "and DNA confirmation." He produced another folder. "If we're applying a strict bloodline test as Douglas insists, then I am Eleanor's only biological child, and Jennifer, as my biological daughter, is her only blood grandchild." Harrison looked stricken as he examined the documents, his loyalty to Douglas visibly warring with his professional obligations. "This is outrageous," Douglas shouted, rising from his chair. "I won't stand for this slander." "You're the one who insisted only blood relatives deserve the Blackwell fortune," I reminded him quietly. "Are you retracting that position now?" Before Douglas could respond, the library doors opened to reveal a frail but determined Bernard Walsh, grandmother's personal attorney, leaning on a cane. "I apologize for my tardiness," he said, nodding to me. "I believe my presence is required for this reading." Harrison's dismay confirmed our suspicion. Bernard's unexpected recovery threatened whatever legal maneuvering Douglas had orchestrated in his absence. "I would like to review the documents before proceeding," Bernard insisted, his experienced gaze already noting the tension filling the room. As Bernard settled at the table with the various test results and adoption papers spread before him, Douglas looked truly afraid for the first time. Whatever scheme he had constructed with Harrison was rapidly unraveling, but his desperation made him unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Bernard adjusted his reading glasses as he reviewed the final pages of grandmother's will, his voice steady and authoritative. "Before addressing specific bequests, I must draw attention to a letter Eleanor Blackwell instructed me to read if questions of lineage arose during this proceeding." He opened a sealed envelope, the Blackwell crest embossed on heavy cream paper. The room fell silent as he began to read, "To my family gathered here. If this letter is being read, then the secret I have kept for decades has finally surfaced. I have always known that Douglas was not born of Blackwell blood, but was welcomed into our family through adoption, a noble act of love by my husband and myself after years of heartbreak. I have also known, since the moment I first held her, that Jennifer is James's biological daughter. A grandmother knows her own blood. The Blackwell Trust established by my father requires blood relation for principal inheritance. Having anticipated potential conflict, I have restructured my personal assets, which constitute the majority of what you now call the Blackwell fortune, to reflect my wishes rather than outdated notions of bloodline purity. To Douglas, you have been my son in every way that matters, but your treatment of Jennifer, your brother's child, has revealed a character that dishonors the Blackwell name you so jealously guard. By your own insistence on blood qualification, you have disqualified yourself from what you most covet. Bernard paused, looking directly at Douglas, whose face had gone ashen. In accordance with Eleanor's explicit instructions, Bernard continued, and in light of the DNA evidence presented today confirming both Douglas's adoption and Jennifer's parentage, the distribution is as follows. The trust assets requiring Blackwell bloodline pass to James Blackwell and his biological daughter, Jennifer. Eleanor's personal estate will be distributed according to the specific bequests outlined here. Douglas lunged for the documents, but Bernard calmly shifted them away. You promised! Douglas shouted at me, desperation breaking through his composed facade. You said only blood relatives deserve the fortune. No, I corrected him quietly. You said that. I merely asked if you would keep your word about it. And you promised you would. The justice of this moment wasn't in the inheritance itself, but in watching Douglas's carefully constructed reality crumble under the weight of his own hypocrisy. The aftermath of the will reading unfolded like the final act of a Greek tragedy. Douglas, undone by his own machinations, stormed from the mansion shouting threats of legal challenges that everyone present knew would fail. Harrison Mills followed, his professional reputation in tatters after Bernard revealed his knowledge of the adoption records he had deliberately concealed. My brothers, stunned by the revelations, approached me uncertainly. Thomas, always the more sensitive of the two, spoke first. I had no idea about any of this, he said quietly. All those years, the way he treated you, it makes a terrible kind of sense now. William nodded soberly. For what it's worth, you've always been our sister. That hasn't changed. Their sincerity moved me more than I expected. They had been shaped by Douglas too, in different ways. Perhaps there was a relationship worth salvaging there, given time. Mother approached next, relief and apprehension mingling in her expression. I should have told you years ago, she said. You were protecting me, I finished for her. I understand that now. The most profound conversation came later that evening, when James and I sat in grandmother's study, surrounded by the books and artifacts of a family history we were both rewriting in our minds. What will you do now? He asked, the weight of missed years heavy in his voice. Build something new, I answered simply. We can't recover the time we lost, but perhaps we can create something better going forward. He smiled, the expression so similar to my own that I wondered how I hadn't seen the resemblance before. I'd like that very much. As we talked into the night, sharing stories and discovering connections, I felt grandmother's presence in the room, her wisdom, her foresight, her absolute certainty that truth would eventually prevail. She had arranged everything perfectly, ensuring that justice would be served without requiring me to deliver it personally. In the end, Douglas's downfall came not from my actions, but from his own character revealed under pressure. He had spent decades ensuring I felt like an outsider in the family, never suspecting that he was the true outsider all along. The irony was perfect, and perfectly sufficient. As I looked toward the future, a future that included a father who actually wanted me in his life, I realized that was the greatest inheritance of all.